You may feel as though you are losing your mind reading the same book for the 50th time. You know every page, you know every picture. You may even know exactly where your child will interrupt you. And just when you suggest a different book, your child hugs the old favorite and says, "This one," again. But while the story feels repetitive to you, your child may be doing something new with it every night. Research suggests that repeated story reading can help young children learn and remember words. Familiarity may also give them more opportunities to notice details, anticipate what happens next, and participate in the storytelling. However, we need to be precise. Scientists have not shown that one favorite book automatically creates high-speed neural pathways, produces phonetic mastery, or directly lowers a child's cortisol. The strongest evidence is more specific and more believable. It concerns attention, vocabulary, memory, interaction, and the value of a consistent bedtime routine. Think about what your child experiences the first time they hear a story. Every page is new. They are trying to understand the characters, the pictures, the actions, the unfamiliar words, and the sound of each sentence. That's a lot of information competing for attention. During later readings, much of that information is already familiar. Your child knows that the bear will lose his hat. They know which animal appears behind the door. They know that the funny sentence is coming. Researchers studying repeated story reading have suggested that this stable context may reduce some of the attention required to follow the plot. That could leave more attention available for unfamiliar words and small details. This is a cognitive explanation. It should not be presented as direct evidence that researchers watched new synapses form while children listened to the same story. One important experiment was published in 2011 by researchers Jessica Horst, Kelly Parsons, and Natasha Bryan at the University of Sussex. 16 three-year-old children were introduced to unfamiliar objects with invented names. Some children heard the same stories repeatedly. Other children heard different stories containing the same new words. Crucially, every child heard each new word the same number of times. The main difference was whether the surrounding stories stayed familiar or kept changing. The children who heard the same stories were more successful at recalling and retaining the new word and object connections. The children hearing different stories had much more difficulty retaining them. That is a striking finding, but it was also a small laboratory study involving only 16 children from relatively similar backgrounds. It supports the idea, but it does not prove that every child will respond in exactly the same way. Even before children understand full stories, they are sensitive to patterns in language. In a classic 1996 experiment, researchers Jenny Safran, Richard Aslan, and Elissa Newport exposed 8-month-old infants to a continuous stream of unfamiliar syllables. There were no pauses showing where one pretend word stopped and another began. The infants nevertheless detected which syllables regularly occurred together. After only a brief exposure, their listening behavior showed that they could distinguish familiar word-like patterns from unfamiliar combinations. That experiment was not about bedtime books, but it demonstrated something important. Even babies can track regularities in the sounds they hear. A familiar story is full of regularities. The same phrases appear in the same order. The same picture accompanies the same words. The problem leads to the same solution. The rhythm of the sentence becomes predictable. That helps explain why children begin finishing familiar sentences. When you pause and your child supplies the missing word, they are retrieving information from memory and using the story's pattern to predict what belongs next. They are no longer only listening, they are participating. An earlier study by researcher Monique Seneschal included 33-year-olds and 34-year-olds. Some children heard a story once. Other children heard it 3 times. A third group heard it repeatedly and was asked questions about the new words. Multiple readings helped children acquire both receptive vocabulary, meaning words they could understand, and expressive vocabulary, meaning words they could say. Asking children to label the target objects was particularly helpful for expressive vocabulary. This suggests that repetition and conversation can work together. Simply hearing a word again creates another opportunity to learn it, but pointing to the picture, briefly explaining the word, asking a gentle question, or allowing the child to say it may make the experience more active. A 2018 meta-analysis brought together 38 studies involving 2,455 children. Across those studies, shared storybook reading supported word learning. The analysis found especially useful evidence for interactive or dialogic reading and for giving children repeated exposure to important words. The effect of repeating the entire story was more variable when researchers controlled for other factors. In other words, repetition matters, but how the adult reads also matters. A separate systematic review examined 19 randomized controlled trials involving 2,594 children between approximately 1 and 6 years old. Book sharing interventions produced small positive effects on children's receptive and expressive language. They also produced a much larger improvement in caregivers' book sharing skills. This broader evidence is important because the strongest same-story experiments focused mainly on preschool-aged children rather than very young toddlers. So your child does not need a different book every night to encounter useful language. A familiar book can become a kind of practice space. At first, your child follows the story. Later, they notice the words. Then they begin predicting, answering, correcting you, and retelling parts themselves. This is where we need to separate an appealing theory from direct evidence. A familiar story may feel comforting. Many children clearly prefer predictable routines, especially when they are tired. But there is not strong direct evidence showing that repeating the exact same bedtime story lowers cortisol in toddlers. The bedtime research has examined broader routines rather than the biological effect of one repeated book. In a 2009 study, 405 mothers and their children between 7 and 36 months old were assigned either to continue their usual routine or to introduce a consistent sequence of activities before bed. The children in the routine groups fell asleep more quickly, experienced improvements in night waking, and had better sleep continuity. Mothers also reported improvements in mood. However, the intervention involved an entire routine, including activities such as bathing, massage, and quiet time. It did not isolate the effect of rereading one particular story. Another study collected information from mothers of more than 10,000 children from infancy to age 5 across an international sample. More frequent bedtime routines were associated with earlier bedtimes, shorter periods before falling asleep, fewer night wakings, and longer sleep. Because that study was observational, it showed an association rather than proving that routines alone caused the improvements. The evidence-safe conclusion is this: a repeated book can become one familiar part of a predictable bedtime routine. The child sees the book. They sit in the usual place. They hear the familiar voice and opening sentence. They know that sleep comes afterwards. That sequence may be reassuring, but we should describe it as a familiar cue, not as a scientifically proven cortisol switch. There is another fascinating connection between bedtime reading and learning. Sleep helps the brain stabilize some newly learned information. In a 2014 experiment, researchers Sophie Williams and Jessica Hurst studied 48 3-year-olds. Children heard either the same story repeatedly or several different stories containing unfamiliar words. Some children then had their normal afternoon nap while others remained awake. Repeated stories supported word learning. Sleeping shortly after the reading also supported later word retention, particularly when the original learning experience had been more difficult. The children were tested again after 2.5 hours, 1 day, and 1 week. The results suggested that both repetition and sleep could contribute to remembering the new words. However, the researchers did not randomly force children to nap or stay awake. The groups were partly based on whether the children normally napped. That limitation means the sleep findings should be interpreted carefully. This does not mean that reading immediately before sleep guarantees that every new word will be stored permanently. It means bedtime may be a useful learning window. because quiet, shared reading exposes children to language, and sleep soon afterwards may support memory consolidation. You do not need to turn bedtime into a lesson or a quiz. The goal is still connection, enjoyment, and settling down. But you can gently add a new layer to a familiar story. During one reading, simply enjoy the book. During the next reading, point to one interesting object and name it. Another night, pause before a familiar word and give your child time to complete the sentence. You might ask, "What do you think happens next?" Or, "Why does she look worried?" You can connect the story to real life. Remember when we saw a digger like that? That character feels disappointed. Have you ever felt disappointed? Use only 1 or 2 questions at a time. Follow your child's interest. If they are tired and only want to listen, let them listen. Research on dialogic reading does not mean interrogating a child after every page. It means creating small opportunities for the child to point, name, predict, explain, or retell. And eventually, add variety. Familiarity can help initial learning and retention. New books and new situations may help children expand meanings, encounter different vocabulary, and apply what they know in other contexts. The goal is not to read one story forever. A helpful pattern might be familiarity first, then gentle variation later. So when your child carries that familiar book toward you again, remember this. The repetition may be tiring for you, but it is not necessarily empty for them. They may be recognizing patterns, remembering new words, anticipating what comes next, practicing how to tell a story, and finding comfort in a familiar bedtime sequence. The same book is not a magical brain development shortcut. It is something simpler and more credible. A familiar environment in which a young child can listen, remember, participate, and gradually notice more. Tonight, instead of asking, "How many more times do I have to read this?" try asking, "What is my child noticing this time?"